Hello, my name is Paige Cameron and my student ID number is 11641818. On the 7th of May 2019, Fresh Air from Y in Philadelphia spoke about a prominent issue present in contemporary society. If you have a look on the part A of my assessment posted on the journal, you'll see a link to the full podcast, which I encourage you to listen to. I'll share an interesting fact with you. Did you know on average, 20 people per minute are physically abused by an intimate partner in the United States? Before we dive into the detail, I'll introduce you to the speakers on this particular episode. Pictured on the left is Terry Gross. She has been a host on Fresh Air since 1975. Prior to that, Terry worked at a public radio station in New York. Terry has achieved significant successes at Fresh Air, including attracting on average over 4 million listeners each week. Terry was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York. Pictured in the middle is Rachel Louise Snyder, an American journalist, writer, and professor. She recently published a book called No Visible Bruises, which speaks about domestic violence prevention, discusses why people stay with their abusive partners, and talks about risk assessment and intervention. On the right is Suzanne Dubas, which is CEO of the Janine Geiger Crisis Center, Massachusetts. Their mission there is to empower individuals and engage in communities to end domestic violence. Suzanne has her own story of domestic abuse survival, which led her to the center. Domestic violence is a global crisis. As defined on reachout.com, domestic violence or family violence is violent, abusive, or intimidating behavior in a relationship. There are many types of domestic violence, including social, physical, sexual, and emotional. The panel explained that domestic violence is not a single event and that it happens over a period of time. It can start out quite minor and turn quite severe in a short or long period of time. To put this into context, here are some very real statistics about domestic violence in America from the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence. 1 in 4 women and 1 in 4 men experience severe intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner contact sexual violence, and intimate partner stalking with impacts such as injury, fearfulness, post-traumatic stress disorder, use of victim services, contraction of sexually transmitted diseases, and more. On a typical day, there are more than 20,000 phone calls placed to domestic violence hotlines nationwide in America. And lastly, intimate partner violence accounts for 15% of all violent crimes. The reason why I'm focusing on America is because this podcast focuses on America because it's broadcast in America. To put that in perspective, I thought I'd just outline a few statistics within Australia. These statistics are available on the White Ribbon Australia page. On average, 1 woman a week is murdered by her current partner or former partner in Australia. 1 in 4 women have experienced emotional abuse by a current or former partner since the age of 15. 1 in 5 women have experienced sexual violence since the age of 15. 85% of Australian women have been sexually harassed. Almost 40% of women continue to experience violence from their partner while temporarily separated. 1 in 6 women have experienced stalking since the age of 15. And lastly, statistics indicate that domestic violence rates are higher in rural and regional New South Wales. Domestic violence has been an issue around the globe for a very long time. You could consider some of the laws introduced to fight against domestic violence as some form of a win. However, in some countries, it is still not a crime, and additionally, domestic violence still occurs around the world, as the statistics prove. The American University Washington published a domestic violence and sexual assault public policy timeline outlining some of the positive changes introduced in America to protect victims of domestic violence. As mentioned by the panel, laws initially introduced in 1991 were foundational in this positive movement. In Australia, laws vary state by state, but there is a significant amount of legislation to protect people, including in New South Wales, the Crimes, Domestic and Personal Violence Act, in Queensland, the Domestic and Family Violence Protection Act, in South Australia, Domestic Violence Act, in Tasmania, the Family Violence Act, and this continues with acts in Victoria, Western Australia, ACT, Northern Territory, and New Zealand. Prosecutors are now as described by the panel, more equipped to address these instances and prosecute accordingly. Another key point I took away from the podcast was that so many of us are touched by domestic violence, even though we may not know. We'd hope that we would not experience ourselves, but sadly, the statistics prove that people around us may. Rachel, for instance, researched domestic violence in preparation of publishing her book for 8 years. Just before she published it, her stepmom spoke up about having a past of domestic violence in her childhood years and throughout her previous relationship. Rachel knew her stepmom for 38 years and she never once shared that information with her daughter. Suzanne, on the other hand, also speaks up about her experience with domestic violence throughout the podcast. She explains how their relationship began so lovely and genuine and how it quickly turned. Rachel's story was one of the main talking points on the podcast, so I highly recommend you listen to the podcast to hear her full individual story, the struggles she faced and how she escaped, and what she is doing now to help others. It is clear that domestic violence is hugely unethical, as the behavior clearly falls well outside of what is considered morally right. Focusing on the positives, laws are becoming strict to protect victims and prevent cases of domestic violence. And furthermore, there is an increasing amount of support, services, and resources for victims. Unlike many other ethical issues we've discussed so far in COM 221, there is no divide in opinion on this subject. Majority of society stand against domestic violence. In fact, I would say all stand against domestic violence and believe it should end. Interestingly enough, in the recent campaigns following the federal election, there was some politicians who used their stage to present the issue. Labor even committed to spending more than $660 million on family violence prevention. I want to share 3 main points I learned from listening to this podcast. It is important to understand what domestic violence is and the different severities of it, including the different types and acknowledging the extent to which it is both unethical and illegal. The second I would like to discuss is to understand what services are available to victims. I will touch on them in my next slide. And the third I wanted to share was, where appropriate, encourage and support victims to remove themselves from the situation and seek help. There's so many services out there to support these victims, and if you can make a difference, I think that you should step up and do so. If that is listening, if that is referring them to services, do what you can. and support these people who are in horrible situations. You can visit White Ribbon Australia website page to see a list of contact details for services that may be able to support victims of domestic violence, 3 of which include the 1-800-RESPECT line, Lifeline, and the Relationships Australia hotline. Many people may think that domestic violence is just physical abuse, but it is important to remember that there is other types of abuse that fall under domestic violence. There may not be any sign of physical violence, and there may be other controlling behaviors manifesting in the isolation of friends and family, limited access to money, surveillance on everyday tasks, intercepting mails, calls, and texts, and threats to harm or kill anyone. My personal opinion is that we need to keep fighting strong against domestic violence. We need to continue tightening laws, continue to develop, increase, and provide support to victims, and we need to educate people, prevent these issues young, and put an immediate end to when it does happen. I agree to the statement made by Bowen that my conviction is that if we are serious about ending domestic violence, we must be willing to address all aspects of aggression and violence in families. We must hold men and women accountable for their behaviors and how they choose to participate in their relationship dynamics. These are a list of the references that I used for my presentation. Thank you for listening.